We just listened to the first 2 episodes of a new podcast, and we want to tell you all about it.
The show is called Nobody Should Believe Me, and it's a groundbreaking investigation into Munchausen by proxy. Anyone who listens to Murder Sheet knows we really appreciate a deep dive into a subject. Well, no one has ever done anything of this depth and breadth on the topic before. You will be enthralled by the stories it tells, but even more importantly, you will learn a great deal about how to keep kids in your community safe from harm.
But what makes this show different is that the host of the podcast, novelist Andrea Dunlop, has a uniquely personal connection to this subject. Someone close to her was investigated for Munchausen by proxy a while ago. So to her, this is not just something that happens to other people. Her personal story really gives this show an emotional punch.
It also means she really makes an effort to get at the humanity of all of the people involved, all the victims and survivors. This isn't a podcast that focuses on the gruesome details. It has heart. Andrea really uses her storytelling skills to help us get to know the wide variety of people whose lives have been affected by Munchausen by proxy.
New episodes drop every Thursday. Listen and subscribe to Nobody Should Believe Me on Apple Podcasts or wherever you listen to podcasts.
Content warning. This episode contains discussion of murder. If you haven't done so already, please go back and listen to our last 2 episodes, the first and the second part of our look at the 2017 murders at Nadia Fish and Chicken in the South Shore neighborhood of Chicago.
As a refresher, on the night before the killings at the restaurant, a man named Jerry Jacobs was gunned down in the South Shore. The next afternoon, a gunman killed 4 young men at the Nadia restaurant. Hours later, someone murdered a couple in their car in an area not far from the earlier murders. The police quickly arrested Jerry Jacobs' 19-year-old son, Maurice Harris, claiming that he had killed the 4 men at the restaurant in retaliation for the death of his father. And then they went to the media. Here is Maurice's attorney, Ian Barney.
Yes, right after Maurice was arrested, the Chicago Police Department held a press conference with, I believe, then Superintendent Eddie Johnson, and posted his face all over TV, painted him as guilty, laid out this purported motive for the killing, tried to paint him as a really bad guy, got into his juvenile record, which I thought was way out of bounds. And, all in all, made their best effort to prove him guilty before he even had a chance to go to court.
Is that kind of a trial by media a common occurrence in Chicago, or was this something that you were surprised by?
I was not surprised by it. Is it a common occurrence? I wouldn't say it's necessarily a common occurrence, but you do have what is sometimes referred to as heater cases or media cases where press conferences like that can happen. In this case, I wasn't particularly surprised because, one, it was a big case because you had a quadruple homicide. 4 individuals were killed in one shooting, which is obviously not something that happens too often. But also it happened during a short period of time where there were a lot of shootings, a lot of murders, and in my view, a lot of pressure on public officials and probably the Chicago Police Department to stem the tide, as one might say, because things seem to be kind of spinning out of control. There was actually a double homicide that same day that occurred at about 11:30 p.m. This quadruple homicide happened at around 3:30 p.m. And there were other murders that happened right around that same time in the preceding days. And I'm not sure if there were any that happened after that, but I would be surprised to learn that there were. So it was, that was the whole thing, the whole kind of period of of days was newsworthy. And this particular event, I think, was representative of maybe a larger feeling that things were getting out of control, more so than usual.
Of course, the police weren't the only ones to feel pressure.
There's a cliche that the most stressful thing for a criminal defense attorney to have is a client who they know is innocent. And so I'm curious, what kind of a personal toll did taking this case and working this case take on you?
I guess I'd say there's some truth to that. And I think what's maybe interesting is that people usually think it's the opposite, that and maybe clients even think this, that if somebody's innocent, it should be easier. And in some ways, it's actually harder because, you want to prove they're innocent. And that's a very hard thing to do. It's a very hard thing to do, particularly when the state kind of holds the cards at the beginning of the process, which they do. And if they didn't, they wouldn't charge you. So, it took a toll. Just kind of from a mental standpoint, just you live with, the case pended for 4 years, live with that for 4 years, just constantly thinking, what more can I do? What can we investigate? What's this witness going to say? Who was out there that could help us with this case? And I would just call people and ask them that, hey, who do you know out there who could maybe point me to somebody who could help me? Because the stakes are obviously high, and when you have somebody who you truly believe is innocent, I think that there's a strong impetus to make sure you get it right for them. And that's not to say that you're not doing everything you can for every client you have. Obviously, you are, but I think there's just maybe an extra motivating factor if you truly believe the person hadn't done it. So I guess I would just say, there was probably some added stress. I wanted to do right by Maurice. I wanted to make sure I got the right result for him. I didn't think he did it, and I didn't want him to be sitting in custody at all. So I wanted to make sure that I got it right.
But how do you get it right and save your client after the police department does its best to convince the whole city that he is a murderer?
My name is Áine Cain.
And I'm Kevin Greenlee.
And this is The Murder Sheet, a weekly true crime podcast.
Áine and I connected over the Burger Chef murders, a 1978 unsolved case involving the killings of 4 young restaurant employees.
Now we're looking to track restaurant homicides. To help us understand the patterns of these crimes, we created a spreadsheet of nearly 1,000 eatery-related killings, the Murder Sheet. We'll be drawing on that data throughout Season 1 to give you a deep dive into undercovered crimes.
We don't just rely on skimming the headlines. We dive into these cases to bring you in-depth coverage. We're the Murder Sheet, and this is In the Shadow of Nadia, The Discovery.
It was a very weird ride. Like I said, I would get calls all the time from random numbers, people who would have just the strangest things to tell me. Who they thought that and why they thought this person did it. And, a lot of it was just conjecture. But, I took every phone call and I followed up on every meeting on the hope that something would pan out. And some of it did. So, it worked out. I'm glad I'm glad people were calling me. And I don't know how they got my number, but I'm glad they were calling me. But one of the witnesses who contacted me, I don't even know how she got my contact information, but she happened to be an eyewitness who was never interviewed by the police. And she was present right across the street from Nadia's when the shooting happened. She told us about how the shooting happened, and she kind of ducked and hid next to her under a picnic table type of thing. But while she was laying down, she could see the shooter who had actually chased one of the victims. And that was one of the important things about her statement was she knew some details about the crime that weren't publicly available, that she wouldn't have known from watching the news. So she gave us this version of what she saw from her perspective, the shooter, shooting somebody, chasing somebody else down, then running back in another direction. And she, according to her, saw the shooter's face. She doesn't know who the person was, but she knows it wasn't Maurice. And one of the reasons she knows it wasn't Maurice is because she saw Maurice's face on TV when they posted a story about the news, and they posted his photograph, a mugshot, I think. And she didn't know Maurice personally, and she didn't really have any stake in the case other than, kind of telling us what she saw. So that was another important piece of evidence that we were able to get. And that was kind of, it was fortuitous that she decided to pick up the phone and call me. But, that wasn't the end of the story. We ended up having to, obviously get her statement, which was not easy, kind of chasing her around for weeks to find her and actually get her to sit down and give an investigator a real statement that she signed. So that was a big deal.
This new witness's story was important, but the ideal witness in any case, of course, is video footage from a security camera.
And that was one of the things that we tried to do. I mean, there were security cameras all over. I shouldn't say all over, but there's businesses in that area, and there's apartment buildings in that area, and some of them have security cameras. So, one thing I did is I just drove around looking for security cameras and contacting building owners to try to get security camera footage. And, I don't think I was successful. And in fact, the police actually did that anyway. They canvassed and they got a lot of security footage. They got some security footage that I thought was actually, pretty useful, pretty interesting. Cars driving, the wrong way down a one-way street just after the shooting. And I don't know if these are people, just citizens trying to get out of there or somebody involved in the shooting fleeing the area. But so there was quite a bit of security footage, video footage in general from CTA buses and businesses and apartment buildings, private homeowners, things like that. So there was quite a bit of that, and there was a lot of stuff to go through,
The efforts of the investigators paid off, and they found the footage they wanted. Almost.
There wasn't video of the shooting. There was a video from a security camera facing a direction where the shooter eventually ran. Unfortunately, it didn't catch the whole suspect. You could only see from the waist down, if even that, of the person. So you can see their legs. That's it. Interestingly, there was a camera in the entryway to Nadia's, and it was on. It just wasn't recording. It was live. It was a live feed, and for some reason, I think it was supposed to record to the cloud, but or something to that effect, or some record to a device. I'm not sure, but it wasn't recording. It was only running live or something like that. So, had that thing been set up properly, there would be no question about who committed the crime.
But perhaps the footage the police did have would be enough to exonerate Maurice. Let's take a quick break from the murder sheet to tell you about a podcast investigating yet another unforgettable crime. The Orange Tree is a 7-part series about a 2005 homicide that happened near the University of Texas at Austin. The murder of 21-year-old Jennifer Cave, who was shot, dismembered, and left in a bathtub at her friend Colton Petoniak's apartment, continues to haunt the area to this day.
Like the Burger Chef murders, this case features plenty of twists and turns, including Colton's flight to Mexico with another UT student, Laura Hall. Both were later convicted in connection with the crime, although Colton has continued to appeal his verdict and claim innocence. The business student turned convicted murderer now says that he doesn't even remember much about the night Jennifer died.
The Orange Tree is reported on and produced by Haley Butler and Tanu Thomas, who were both seniors at the University of Texas when they started this project. Together, Haley and Tanu strive to piece together this tragic story in an in-depth podcast that features audio from courtroom scenes and interrogation rooms, prison phone calls, and exclusive interviews with both the perpetrators and the victim's family. You can binge all 7 episodes of The Orange Tree today on Apple Podcasts or wherever you listen to podcasts. And now, back to the murder sheet.
There was some video footage of the shooting, and you couldn't see the shooter, but you could kind of get a glimpse of the lower half of the shooter's body running away from the scene. And in our mind, it couldn't have been Maurice, because Maurice had been the victim of a shooting when he was just 14 years old, as I think a kind of collateral damage of a shooting, as he was standing at a bus stop and had been shot in the kind of hip or buttocks area and had suffered nerve damage into his foot as a result, had dropped foot because of it. So he couldn't run with a clean gait. He had a limp, so it wouldn't have, I don't think it would have fit that it was him, just based on the video, a person who's running pretty quickly without a limp. So that was another important piece of evidence that we were able to kind of get those medical records that corroborated that Maurice had suffered this injury and had dropped foot.
Maurice's defense also found more traditional witnesses to back up his claims of innocence.
We had numerous alibi witnesses who were willing to come to court at the time of trial and testify that they were with Maurice at the time that the shooting occurred. And, you always have to have a skeptical eye when talking with witnesses, in my view, because people always have motive, interest, or bias. But we had multiple witnesses, and they were all interviewed separately, and they all gave substantially similar accounts, including on small details that would be hard to fabricate and coordinate. So we felt we had a pretty strong alibi. These were good witnesses in our view. So that would have been kind of the initial thrust of any defense, would have been he was actually someplace else when the murder occurred. And one of the interesting things about the alibi was multiple witnesses who he was with specifically recall actually learning about the quadruple homicide, because they're on social media or whatever, and this stuff comes through on these Twitter accounts and like Spot News, for example. And I'm not sure if it was Twitter or Instagram or Facebook or whatever, but there's these social media accounts, and they kind of spit this information out about ongoing criminal activity in Chicago, in particular about shootings, in real time. And multiple witnesses who we talked to actually remember this happening, this receiving this information as it's coming in, learning that one person was shot, then 2 people were shot, and then 20 minutes later getting an update that it was 3 people, and all that kind of stuff. And they remember everybody kind of being I wouldn't say in shock, but just kind of like really surprised, because they, this is not something that happens every day. So perhaps that's why it sticks in their memory. But, they recall Maurice being there. They recall actually learning the news about the shooting. So I thought they had pretty compelling stories when it came to supporting Maurice's alibi that he wasn't at the scene. And then also we had cell phone evidence that would have corroborated where he was. There were some debate about which phone was the right phone as far as the phone that was Maurice's and stuff like that. But there was cell phone records that, they do this triangulation thing where they try to, not pinpoint necessarily where you are based on phone calls, but at least put you in a specific area based on cell phone towers and which towers your phone's connected to and things like that. And cell phone records for Maurice's phone were actually consistent with him being in the area where the alibi witnesses said he was, as opposed to the area where the restaurant was. So that was another critical piece of evidence in my mind, in part, again, because you have witnesses and that the state is going to try to expose any motive, interest, or bias that those witnesses might have. But we, having cell phone records that corroborated the alibi, I think gave the alibi witnesses some extra credibility. As far as other witnesses, this was a very odd case in that I was getting calls out of the blue about this case from random people who wanted to help because they knew whether or not they were there. They knew from whatever they knew on the street, whatever people were saying, they knew that Maurice didn't do it. And so they would call me and they would try to give me leads and say, hey, you should check this out. Or, hey, I heard that it could have been, someone else with some other motive. A lot of the stuff we would try to run down, and either it was impossible because information was too vague, or it maybe was a little bit of a dead end in terms of it was interesting, but it wasn't the type of thing that you could present in court. But some of the stuff ended up being fruitful. We tracked down another witness who was also in the area when the shooting happened. He was down a block, and he said he kind of was standing outside when the shooting happened, and he couldn't identify who these shooters were, but he saw the people walking up and down the block in front of where the shooting happened just before it happened, and he knows who Maurice Harris is because Maurice is from that neighborhood, and this person actually knows Maurice's mom, and he said it was not Maurice Harris. So we were able to track down some witnesses like that, and again, they were, in my view, they were credible witnesses.
In a criminal case, there is a process called discovery, in which the prosecution is obliged to share with the defense the information and evidence they have uncovered during the course of their investigation. So, somewhat ironically, a few of the most helpful things Barney learned actually came from the prosecution.
Then, as discovery went on, we got the initial police reports, and we started to get some additional information that was pretty interesting. One of the things that we got was information about an individual who was a suspect in another murder, a totally different murder in a totally different part of the city, who had confessed to committing the murder that he was basically a suspect in, or at least gave some type of statement. I don't know if confessed is maybe too strong of a word. I don't specifically recall exactly what he said, but I know that he gave a statement regarding that murder that he was a suspect in. And in his statement, he actually gave information that was exculpatory to our case, in that he said that he was a witness at the quadruple homicide that happened at Nadia's, and that Maurice Harris was not the person that did it, that they had the wrong guy. So that was kind of the first big piece of evidence that we were able to get that indicated that Maurice was not the person who committed that crime. And of course, that's what we had believed from the beginning. It didn't make a whole lot of sense in our mind, having known Maurice and having had a previous relationship with Maurice. It didn't make a lot of sense that he would have been the person to commit that crime. So that was the first big piece of evidence. And it was, it kind of came out of left field. You don't see that too often, where somebody gives a statement in a totally, or at least somewhat unrelated case, and they're a suspect in that case, and they give information exculpatory to somebody else who's got a pending case. So that was a big deal for our case, and that was that was separate from our investigation that came through discovery with the state.
But of course, Barney and his team kept up with their own efforts.
We continued our investigation. We were able, I think we talked about the fact that we were able to speak with some of the eyewitnesses, a couple of the eyewitnesses who we felt like walked back their identification a little bit, at least a little bit, maybe even more than that. I think one kind of recanted totally. And then as the case went on, we got another kind of tip, so to speak, from somebody who was in Cook County Jail who reached out to us. I can't remember how they got in touch with us. I don't know if it was through our client, through a third party. I just don't recall. But this person who was in Cook County, who was had their own criminal case pending, came into some information that was helpful to us, and they kind of clued us in on it. And specifically, they had a conversation on a recorded jail call with one of the witnesses in our case who, in so many words, admitted on the jail call that she may not have actually seen the person who did the shooting, which was contrary to either what she told the police or what was in the police reports. So that was a huge piece of evidence, in part because, one of the things that any lawyer does who's advocating for one side of a case, one party in a case, is you try to, get at people's motive, interest, bias, find some reason why they may have said something, even if it wasn't true. So, they may say, oh, well, this witness only said this because they're scared or they were intimidated or they didn't want to be involved in the case or something like that if we would have got, a statement from a witness on the street. But this is a case where someone was on a recorded call talking to someone that they trusted, didn't either realize or care that they were being recorded, and were kind of caught in them, I guess some type of moment of vulnerability where they told the truth, that that they may not have actually seen the shooting. So that was a really big piece of evidence for us, and we were able to get the recorded call. The same person who kind of gave us that tip gave us another tip that a family member of that witness had spoken with another inmate on another recorded jail call where the family member kind of corroborated that the witness actually didn't see the shooting. So those were two really, in our minds, powerful pieces of evidence that had corroborated the investigation that we had already been doing with the alibi witnesses. Another witness who was down the block who says they didn't see Maurice at the scene.
I was curious about some of the witnesses you mentioned who recanted or said they weren't even there. Did you ever get any insight into why they made up stories and identified Maurice?
Well, it wasn't that they weren't there. It just, I think there was, I think I know what you're talking about when you say they weren't there. There was two statements that conflicted where one person said they were, inside the restaurant, and based on their observations, the other witness who also said that they were present in almost the same location when the shooting occurred. Based on these two statements, they both couldn't be telling 100% of the truth because based on both each story, the other person wasn't there, or they didn't see the other person. So, I don't know. I don't know why those statements were crossed up in the way that they were. I don't know if someone was fabricating. Somebody remembers something differently from somebody else. Sometimes that happens. So, why were these witness statements changing? Why was there recantation? I don't know. That's a hard question to answer, to be honest. I mean, I don't know what would have caused someone to identify Maurice if they didn't actually see him. But my position is that happened. I absolutely believe that happened. I think that, I guess what I can go back to is the fact that I know that this was a case that was big in the news, that there were a lot of rumors going around the neighborhood about who was involved. And, I think sometimes and I'm not saying this is the reason, but that it happened in this case. But sometimes if people think or are led to believe that somebody, that person A is the person who committed the crime, then they're either want to go along with that story or convince themselves that that's the person who did it, or whatever the case is. So, or maybe they thought Maurice was involved in some way, even if he didn't do the shooting, that he was involved some way, because the rumor was that this whole thing was in retaliation for his father's murder. So I think that, in my view, that would have been a big motivating factor, but I can't ascribe any particular motivation to any particular witness, because I don't know. I'm not in their head. And I don't know what, I wasn't there. I don't know exactly what they saw and what they didn't see. All I know is that some of these things just didn't make a whole lot of sense.
Can Barney make sense of it in time to save the client he is convinced is innocent? We will have more next week. Our next episode will also include a discussion of crucial DNA evidence found in a vehicle connected to the shooting.
Thanks again to Ian Barney for taking the time to talk with us.
Thanks for listening to this episode of The Murder Sheet. As always, thanks to Kevin Tyler Greenlee, who composed the music for The Murder Sheet, and who you can find on the web at kevintg.com.
To keep up with the latest on The Murder Sheet, please make sure to follow us on Instagram and Twitter at Murder Sheet, and on Facebook at MSheet Podcast, or by searching Murder Sheet. If you enjoy listening to The Murder Sheet, please leave us a 5-star review to help us gain more exposure. And send tips, suggestions, and feedback to murdersheet@gmail.com. Thanks so much for listening.